And remember, kids, the next time that somebody tells you the government wouldn't do that, oh yes they would.
We're off to bombing these people. The game now is at the fourth quarter and about 7-8-0. The psychological impact of the Marines are coming.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. Is the price worth it?
We think the price is worth it.
Night, we burned to death 100,000 Japanese civilians.
What are the results of O'Hara? Every Marine alive, one single girl from O'Hara alive, all the homes gone, the library's gone. Every man, woman, and child gone. There was no difference between a baby on O'Hara and Professor Clover on O'Hara. Even if you say the scholars broke the law, what about the majority of people in O'Hara? They paid the price just the same because they were born in the wrong place at the wrong time in history. On the surface, in One Piece, the world government produced this bloody evil act to prevent people learning the true history of the world. I think it is fair to say that the surface level reasons for the Buster Call poorly explain why it would be used. Those that commit indiscriminate attacks use tactics and weapons that cannot distinguish military target from civilian by nature. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited both by the Geneva Convention and international humanitarian law. They constitute a war crime under the Roman Statute of the International Criminal Court. Protected under these laws include the civilian population, cultural objects and places of worship, undefended towns and buildings, and these attacks include releasing bombs over a quote-unquote enemy territory in the hope of incidentally striking a military objective, firing blindly without ensuring that the target is a military combatant, conducting bombing in situations of limited sight, and using nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction. It was Nazi Germany who started using indiscriminate bombing on a regular basis, and it had the stated purpose to break the morale of the British people. In real life, and I think you'll connect it to One Piece, what is the main purpose of selecting civilians as the targets of indiscriminate bombing raids? Materially, it's easy to understand. Why bomb the small tanks and little ant-like soldiers running around on the ground when you can just fly right past them and bomb the women and children that work at the factories that produce their military technology? We do a bad thing, we do an evil thing to save lives in the long run. And like a Buster Call, indiscriminate bombings bomb cities where civilians live, and the line between a civilian labor force production and normal military targets is very blurred. The world government Buster calls O'Hara, calls Nico Robin a devil, a demon, and says anybody that helps you, we're gonna kill them too, and Luffy just says,
if Netanyahu's younger brother just so happened to get, I'm talking dangerous here. Imagine that he gave Luffy some food and he said, you know what? Those Hamas, man, they took everything from me. Luffy's like, really? How dare they do that? And then Luffy goes to fight Hamas. How would you feel? You'd feel upset. Luffy, how could you? The real Luffy would never. That's how he's written.
This is probably one of the single dumbest things I've ever seen in my entire life. Let me just go through real quick all the people that I could think of who Luffy helps without them giving him food or already being his friend. Zoro, Nami, Usopp, Sanji, Chow Chow, Gaimon, Kobe, Vivi, Laboon, Montblanc Cricket, Robin, Chopper. He actually tries to eat Chopper. Brook. Hachi does feed him, but is that why Luffy helps him? I don't think so. Shirahoshi, Trafalgar Law, Smoker, Momonosuke, Kinemon. So it almost looks like Luffy basically helps people regardless if they feed him or not. Kind of feels like Luffy helps people who are oppressed. The rest of my response is going to be exclusive to paid YouTube members and paid patrons. The good news is it's only $1 a month, and your support makes it so that I can continue to make unique content, especially about One Piece, that ultimately will help you have a better understanding of One Piece. The overwhelming force of terror bombing, Buster Calls, it is to inflict psychological damage on the opposition. It is there to destroy your hope. It wants to take everything. But One Piece shows us that it can't take our will, it can't take our dreams, it can't stop us from believing that there's a better reality that is possible, where there is no conquering others. The rise of indiscriminate attacks revolved around World War II, where in Europe the vast majority of cities were subjected to heavy fire. After the war, German and Japanese leaders were not prosecuted for deliberate and indiscriminate air attacks on civilian populations. This is because their bombing campaigns relatively matched the bombing campaigns carried out by the Allies. So in Nuremberg and in the Tokyo indictments, no attempt was made to claim indiscriminate attacks were war crimes, because then they would be just as guilty. See, from the standpoint of the Marines, from the standpoint of the world government, the Buster Call is simply the right for them to defend themselves. Now, on every use of the Buster Call, it is very explicit that that level of force is far beyond defending itself. It's way past disproportionate, and we're at the point where there's a broad consensus that it is evil, that it is an act of genocide. It is ultimately the Buster Call on O'Hara that further radicalizes Monkey D. Dragon from going from a freedom-fighting pacifist to a full-on revolutionary military force. Language is incredibly important here. It would be unacceptable to refer to the O'Hara incident as a war. It would be unacceptable to refer to the Buster Call on Egghead as a war. And so in the same way, it is unacceptable to refer to the genocide in Gaza as a war. It is a weaselly, cowardly move by weak-minded, ego-driven freaks. There is a broad consensus across people, organizations, and institutions that rightfully refer to the situation as a genocide. In truth and in essence, Gaza has been erased. It has been reduced to rubble. There is nothing left. People are still starving every day. Right now, the estimates is that it would take until the year 2050 to just clear the rubble of Gaza. There's still no schools. There's still no hospitals. In fact, they're still bombing the hospitals and killing dozens of people regularly. And just like in One Piece, when there's a Buster Call, the news writes a fluff piece on the side of the aggressor. When the United States was able to reach Japan, we conducted mass fire bombings across Japan, most notably in Tokyo. Much of Tokyo was built on lumber. Firebombing and lumber does not work well together. So in just a 2-day firebombing campaign, this firebombing operation killed 100,000 civilians and made more than 1 million of them homeless. And so in the course of about a year, the United States entered World War II, saying indiscriminate bombing is barbaric, inhumane, evil, and then we got on the action. And we were like, actually, we're the best at this. It's awesome, but if you guys do it to us, that's terror bombing. And then we went on to do that all over the world. Buster Calls are justified by saying everything on that island needs to go because it's not just the explicit military target. That island also has hospitals that heals their injured and sick. The island also has schools that educates the children of our enemies. And you can ultimately connect everything in a society to a military target. And so now everything is a military target. Everybody is a potential military combatant in the future, if you just stretch the definitions far enough. To quote United States General Curtis LeMay, there are no innocent civilians. It is their government and you are fighting a people. You are not trying to fight an armed force anymore. So it doesn't bother me so much to be killing the so-called innocent bystanders. In real life and in One Piece, that justifies bombing hospitals, that justifies bombing homes, that justifies destroying libraries and schools. And then you can't bomb innocent people because now there are no innocent people. Everybody is culpable. These indiscriminate attacks are referred to by the people that are doing them as strategic bombing. If we are getting strategically bombed indiscriminately, then it's terror bombing. But if we're doing it, then it's strategic bombing. Just a small example on the power of language right there. And the purpose of using Gaza here as a parallel to O'Hara is because the prison of Gaza is like O'Hara in that the land, the sea, is a prison for those people on the island. Leaving the island is almost certain death, but that prison fence is tightened when massive naval battleships surround the island, creating a explicit perimeter. Misnaming things, mislabeling things is used as a sort of propaganda. If you refer to the civilians on O'Hara as demons, as devils, as evildoers, as terrorists, then other people with only bits of information who do not have an incentive to look deeper are much more likely to believe that indiscriminate bombings of civilians is justifiable. That is why when governments label people as terrorists, maybe do your own research to what those groups do and believe, and who are the people that are labeling them as terrorists. How far back does the rabbit hole go? And so when the source, the core, the roots of referring to a group as terrorists are, in my opinion, terrorists themselves, just terrorists that put on suits every day, then the label of terrorist loses all meaning. That is why Is Not Real insists that every person in Gaza is a terrorist, because that label itself has been inculcated into the Western mind as our enemies. It's not your boss that pays you poverty wages that's the enemy. It's not the police that beat you and subjugate you to protect property owners. It's not the politicians who are more like fundraisers to serve the interests of billionaires and mega corporations that are the enemy. It is brown people on the other side of the world and their religion that is the enemy. Those people are terrorists. They are the enemy, not us. There are people that will admit that Is Not Real engages in indiscriminate attacks, but they'll use the framework that Is Not Real is waging a war. So you say they're targeting the adversary's military, and some of the civilians just happen to be like in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's a cynical lie. That is not what's happening in Gaza. That is not what happened on O'Hara. The world government wasn't targeting demons. Is Not Real is not targeting Hamas, except in the most trivial, insignificant sense. Anytime in your life you hear somebody refer to what is happening in Gaza as a war, your hairs should stand up on your arms because you are talking to a propagandist. And maybe they'll say, oh, well, I don't think it meets the definition of a genocide. Here is the definition of a genocide. Engaging in activities with the intent of which is to destroy in whole or in part a racial, ethnic, or religious group. That is how it was defined in 1948 following the Holocaust. And that's exactly what Is Not Real's doing. That is exactly what the world government did. And like in One Piece, genocide's real-life buster calls, they don't discriminate between adults and children. They were so upset that they missed a single child of O'Hara that they issued a massive bounty on an 8-year-old girl. About half of the population of Gaza is children. So when you hear about Is Not Real artificially inducing a famine in Gaza, approximately half of those victims are children. So what are the goals of the Buster Call in One Piece? Number 1, revenge. They're trying to prevent an uncomfortable truth of humanity. And so stopping people from reaching that information is preventing it from occurring again. It is the same people that were their enemies during the Void Century that will dig up the past and cause it to happen again. And so it becomes easy to point the fingers at the 5 elders who commanded the attack. But let's not forget, if you take out an individual, the system will just replace it with a carbon copy. It is not simply individuals that can commit genocide, it is a system. So when you hear people condemning the genocide in Gaza, they typically point to Netanyahu specifically. But as much as I wish that was the case, it's not true. It is the mindset of the bloody, violent, colonial, ethno-supremacist occupiers, the people of Is Not Real, who permit this violence to happen. They either lean into it and want more of it, or they turn a blind eye and listen to that easy, soothing propaganda without making any effort to look into it further. The real-world aggressors and celestial dragons are bloodthirsty. They choose not to believe they are the oppressors. They choose to believe they had a God-chosen right to be above their victims. They believe their victims are subhuman. The mountain of blood that celestial dragons built through the rest of the world, giving them money to ensure their own survival. But what if they stop paying the celestial dragons? Can they come take it? Who would defend them? Can celestial dragons as an institution survive without the handouts from the rest of the world? Are they able to produce wealth? Are they able to produce culture? Or are they leeches stealing culture and wealth and land because they are void, a black hole that sucks in more and more infinitely? What if hypothetically mid-Buster Call the victims could record themselves and document their reality live for the rest of the world? Well, we know this in the real world at least. While being genocided by their occupier, Is Not Real society looked away from everything that was happening, believing easier lies and truths, partially because that bloodlust for this destruction is in their own heart. It is embedded into colonial violence. And it's the same for people in One Piece. The Marines and the Navy, they have to believe the world government and the celestial dragons who are known as saints, because what does that make them if they know of it but do nothing? To what degree would that make them culpable? Remember, when Emu used the Mother Flame to erase, to annihilate Lelouch, it is not because it is a strategic military target. It is simply out of amusement. It is simply out of revenge, a personal vendetta. The truth is that the desire for genocide in Gaza is not a product of the State Department of Is Not Real. It is a national project, a project instilled in the minds of the people. When I look at the information, that is simply the truth to the matter. There's a famous poll done that was presented in the Haaretz newspaper, an Israeli newspaper. And in this poll, they clearly ask, with no real room for ambiguity, when the IDF enters a city in Gaza, should they kill everybody in the city? 47% of the Israelis polled said, you should kill everyone. The next month, another poll asked the question, do you believe there are any innocent people in Gaza? 62% said there are no innocents in Gaza. That is the black and white thinking that supports the level of violence shown in One Piece with the Buster Call. If you're anything like me, making sense of a society that thinks this way is enormously difficult. It's a level of dehumanization that I simply cannot imagine. I suppose it's then not a surprise that one of our vassal states behaves in the same way. Now, as much as they use the pretense of military targets to justify indiscriminate bombing, it's pretty easy to figure out that that is not the main purpose. The main purpose is to destroy the psyche of the civilian population and ultimately lead to a quicker unconditional surrender, where then the victor of justice can create any conditions they want. Winston Churchill himself let it slip when writing about the controversial bombing of Dresden. He wrote, "It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing of German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. Otherwise we shall come into control of an utterly ruined land. We gotta use that land to make back the money that we spent on this war." In his novel, Slaughterhouse-Five, Kurt Vonnegut describes the experience of suffering an indiscriminate bombing attack by your own country. They don't simply not bomb you because you're a soldier and you're there and they're going to kill their allies. No, the war machine is much bigger. Soldiers are fodder. So like the Buster Call, if soldiers, world government allies still exist on an island, that does not slow down the Buster Call, the indiscriminate bombing at all. It continues. Even that element of the Buster Call exists in real life. More than 2 years ago, Is Not Real initiated something known as the Hannibal Directive, a military procedure to prevent the capture capture of their own soldiers by enemy forces. How do you prevent the capture of your own soldiers in this scenario? Oh yeah, you bomb them. You eliminate them. You erase them. The Hannibal Directive was understood to apply to situations involving only the IDF soldiers, but not to is not real civilians. And so on that day, they fired on their own civilian hostages as they were being captured and driven into the apartheid region. That sounds even crueler than the Buster Call when the Marines went out and sank ships that were evacuating their island during the Buster Call. And that's something that we've seen in O'Hara and Egghead Island. Now, Is Not Real claims that they didn't do that protocol on that day, but there have been UN commissioned reports supporting these accusations. And as a result, on that day, we don't know how many of the civilians died to the hands of their own nation state. In Slaughterhouse 5, Billy Pilgrim is a prisoner of war in the German city Dresden when Allied forces use indiscriminate bombing to kill massive amounts of the civilian population in Dresden. The main character from Slaughterhouse 5 not only attempts to describe the horror of suffering a Buster-like attack, something that Vonnegut actually lived through as an American prisoner of war imprisoned in Dresden at the time of the actual bombing of Dresden. He refers to it as utter destruction, carnage unfathomable. In a special introduction to the 1976 edition of his own novel, he wrote, "The Dresden atrocity, tremendously expensive and meticulously planned, was so meaningless, finally, that only one person on the entire planet got any benefit from it. I, Kurt Vonnegut, am that person. I wrote this book, which earned a lot of money for me and made my reputation such as it is. One way or another, I got $2 or $3 for every person killed. Some business I'm in." Vonnegut was also a prolific essay writer, and in one of his essays, he paraphrased leaflets dropped by the Allies in the days after the bombings. "To the people of Dresden, we were forced to bomb your city because of the heavy military traffic your railroad facilities have been carrying. We realize that we haven't always hit our objectives. Destruction of anything other than military objectives was unintentional, unavoidable fortunes of war." The second reason for the Buster Call and the genocide in Gaza is to reassert their military power, to serve as a warning to other people in the world. During the negotiations of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, negotiations about the protections of civilians was controversial because British representatives opposed any restriction to the freedom to carry out bombing. They're like, we got to do it. We're the big dogs now. We're just not going to bomb people? And see, it makes sense because at the time, both France and the United Kingdom were engaged in a lot of colonialism, and they were using their air superiority to police those colonies. They didn't want any rebellions. They needed those colonies for all the stolen art and all their valuable minerals. They needed it. So due to colonial empires not wanting to out themselves as perpetrators of evil, they just kind of left out civilian protections. They sort of just left that out. As a consequence of leaving out those civilian protections, between 1945 and 1977, Western nations carried out horribly violent bombing campaigns as part of counterinsurgencies in the global south. These included France and Madagascar, Algeria during the Algerian War, United Kingdom in Malawi, United Kingdom in Kenya, and the United States in Korea, Vietnam, and Cambodia during the Vietnam War and the Korean War. Leading up to the O'Hara incident, Gol D. Roger declared the existence of his vast treasure, the One Piece, and while the world government believed that his death would be a show of force, a warning to everybody, his death ended up igniting further resistance. And so there's a degree of embarrassment where they seem to have lost faith in the world. But using a force such as the Buster Call is a good way to reassert your violence, to remind people what you are capable of if they step out of line. It occurs only a few years after Gol D. Roger's death. The destruction of O'Hara didn't cause fear in the rest of the world as they hoped. Instead, it ignited two key actors, Dr. Vegapunk, who went on to continue researching the true history History, The Void Century, and Monkey D. Dragon, who radicalized further from a freedom-fighting pacifist to a full-on organized revolutionary army. And the Buster Call, the genocide on Gaza, didn't work out the same way that Israel expected. No worthwhile person continues to defend Israel. Everyone that continues to defend Israel is a coward. A sad, smooth-brained coward. The only people continuing to support Israel are people who are paid to do so. Morally bankrupt bots. That is why so much of the Navy in One Piece is hated by the community. They are the supporters of genocide and colonial violence. Whether they believe they do some good things or not, at the end of the day, they are still the muscle behind an institution built from the blood of children's dreams. Now, One Piece is an insanely optimistic and positive story. It has so much darkness too, but that darkness is there as a balancing force to the boundless optimism. This is a story where people chase impossible dreams, knowing that they are almost guaranteed to die. But as long as they're pursuing the dream, it is worth it. So despite the world of One Piece having a Buster Call, having terror bombing, having indiscriminate attacks, Luffy, the Straw Hats, and countless other people still strive for freedom. They dream of one day changing the world, creating a world where their dreams are possible. Because that's what you got to do. If you have an impossible dream, you need to create a world where it is possible. And while the Buster Call is this overwhelming, disproportionate military force that ultimately erases islands, people, and the culture and history of those islands, it has an ugly cousin, something that is at once extremely targeted and also completely indiscriminate of people's lives. This would be the so-called ancient weapon used by Emu with the energy from the Mother Flame, an island erasing laser that erases all life from an island. The immediate real-life parallel has to be the use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a bombing that everybody in the Western world says had to happen, right? We had to drop the bombs to end the war. But the reality is a lot different. Japan was ready to surrender, but they weren't willing to do an unconditional surrender to satisfy the Allies because the leaders of the Japanese military wanted to ensure the survival of the Japanese emperor, who was not only a leader of the Japanese state and empire, but also a religious figure. Leading up to the bombing, Japan really had no shot at legitimately fighting back against the Allies. It's the victors who determine what is justice. So it's not surprising that the United States and the Allies say, those bombs, those were justice. They were necessary and just. From the perspective of the Japanese, these military leaders were fascists who had no issue with sacrificing their civilian lives, the lives of their men in the military. None of that mattered to them, obviously. Tokyo itself had already been completely leveled in a massive, indiscriminate firebombing attack. What was the difference between that and these weapons of mass destruction? Like in One Piece, the story of justice told by the winners is frequently not the full story. So why else would the Allies want to use their newly produced weapons of mass destruction? Here's an alternative explanation. See if it fits the story better than the story told by the victors. Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, sorry if I fucked up your name, argued that the entry of the Soviet Union into the war against Japan, quote, played a much greater role than the atomic bombs in inducing Japan to surrender because it dashed any hope that Japan could terminate the war through Moscow's mediation, end quote. In the same line, a critic of the bombing by American historian Gar Alperovitz said that the United States used nuclear weapons to intimidate the Soviet Union in the early stages of the Cold War. To me personally, when you understand the context at the end of World War II, you see that Japan had nothing left. You see that the Allies, the Western powers, were preparing for the new conflict. And the new conflict would be the loss of their global colonial dominance. And lastly, the dominance of capital, the power that all countries and the owners of the countries were ultimately slaves to. They were preparing the groundwork for the ideological war, the Cold War, against the Soviet Union, a conflict that would ultimately spill over all across the globe in developing nations, future victims of their own buster calls. After World War II, it's never white people who are victims of buster calls. Freeman Dyson, a British-American physicist who had worked as a young man with the RAF Bomber Command during the end of the war, wrote later in his life in 1979, "For many years I had intended to write a book on the bombing. Now I do not need to write it, because Vonnegut has written it much better than I could." Vonnegut recalled having discussed the bombing with Dyson, and quotes Dyson as attributing the decision to bomb Dresden to, quote, bureaucratic momentum. He's saying that the world leaders, the top of the chain, they made the decision to bomb Dresden not to secure a military advantage in Dresden, but to continue their momentum of taking control of the globe on a larger, grander scale that would ultimately overshadow the end of the Second World War. This reminds me that it is the 5 elders that command the buster call on O'Hara. The buster call is not done simply to prevent the scholars of O'Hara from discovering the true history of the world, from reading the poneglyphs. The purpose of the buster call on O'Hara was obviously in response to the wider conflict that they were facing, the Great Pirate Era. Roger's inevitable dream of somebody else one day finding the One Piece and flipping the world upside down. A possibility that terrified the top echelon of the world government. Erasing O'Hara ultimately serves as a warning to the rest of the world, to persuade people from reading the poneglyphs and ultimately finding the One Piece and changing the world. And the third objective of the buster call is clear as well. During the Egghead Island arc, Vegapunk thinks back to the time when he warned Professor Clover to not continue looking into the Void Century. He told him the government knows what you're doing. They're waiting for you to all gather in one place with all your lives and all the evidence of that history so that they can eliminate you once and for all. And it's the same for the genocide and the buster call in Gaza. This was an opportunity for them. This did not begin merely 2 years ago in October. This began almost 80 years ago. They've always wanted to find a solution for the question of Gaza. Mowing the lawn or mowing the grass is a metaphor used to describe periodic is not real attacks on the Gaza Strip to manage the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The phrase implies that the people in the Gaza Strip and their supply of crude, homemade weapons are like weeds that need to be cut back. Is not real, did not distinguish between Palestinian militants, Palestinian civilians, and the civilian infrastructure of the Gaza Strip. That is obviously because they considered all of Gaza as a military target. And former Minister of Israel said in a speech, "He who does not mow the grass mows him." Now, I've mowed grass many times in my life, and I've never once been worried about the grass mowing me. It's only a violent colonist that could come up with such a nonsensical metaphor. They've always wanted to take that land for themselves, to expand the colony. They won't have to do any more mowings of the lawn, which were controversial. The words they use are that they are going to extirpate. They want to pull it out by the roots. They're not mowing the lawn anymore. And so far that has taken 3 ways. At the beginning, they tried to ethnically cleanse Gaza, which they do by turning all their infrastructure into rubble. You simply give them no place to live, which would cause the people of Gaza to flee. Their attacks on Gaza also made most of Gaza completely unlivable. And so for the most part now, we are in the situation where they give the people of Gaza 2 choices: stay here and starve, or leave. Now obviously leaving is easier said than done in this case, and that has been their overall goal for more than 2 years. It has been the goal for about 4 generations. There's been no substantial shift in goals. Have you heard of the Nat Turner Rebellion, the largest slave revolt in American history? In 1831, Nat Turner gives the order to all his rebels, kill all white people. And that's what they did. A brutal, gruesome violence that I cannot described to you here on YouTube. The lowest class that I've studied is the victims of American chattel slavery. If you were abolitionists during this era, you would see them walking in the streets in chains. It was done in the open. During the era of Jim Crow, white people would go to church on Sunday and then immediately, as a congregation in their church clothes with their little children present, go and lynch black people. In the South, they had Saturday markets, but they didn't sell fruits and vegetables and bread. These were slave markets where they would inspect the teeth of slaves to determine their overall health. It was done in the open. And so, for that reason, it is easy to not condemn the violence of a slave revolt. The anti-slavery movement freely admits that what happened during Nat Turner's rebellion was a horror, an atrocity, but they were careful not to condemn Nat Turner. But who did they condemn? White people. We told you so. If you treat people this way, if you degrade them, if you humiliate them, if you beat them, if you treat people this way, then don't be surprised by what happened during Nat Turner's slave revolt. And for me, that is how I reckon with what happened on that day. There's no question that it was an atrocity, that it was violent. But what else is to be expected when you genocide, ethnically cleanse, and force people into an apartheid open-air prison where you continually mow the lawn, aka go on killing sprees? What is to be expected when you generationally remove access to clean, safe water? What would you do in this situation? Would you fight back? Would you keep your head down and just try to hope you're lucky and survive? It's a condition that I cannot imagine myself in. And because of this reality, there has never been a time in my life where I could bring myself to condemn that attack. On the other hand, in a case like Gaza, reflects more of something like O'Hara. By nature of the world being comprised of small islands, people don't necessarily know about O'Hara. Pirates, adventurers, politicians, educators in large kingdoms, they would know of O'Hara, but the global public, they didn't know they existed in the first place. And very few people knew about Gaza before that attack in October 2023. So, when the media machine, the Is Not Real state, the United States State Department, when they all commanded people to condemn the attacks on Is Not Real, everybody was quick to go, I condemn, because they didn't know about it. They didn't know the history. And that's how they justify their 2-year buster call on Gaza. They kept Gaza out of sight, out of mind, and then before people could learn about it, they said, do you condemn? Oh, well, they condemned it, so we are now justified to do a genocide. Luffy says, even if they are a devil, even if they are a monster, they should be free. They shouldn't have their home taken from them. The Buster Call and the world government, the Celestial Dragons and the Navy, they want these people to feel like they're alone, that they have nobody that understands them, nobody that will help them, nobody that cares about them if they live or die. But One Piece is a constant reminder that there are people out there who care about you, that there are people out there who want you to live. There are people out there that need you. And this message is just kind of meaningless if it comes from a story without this level of oppression. This level of oppression makes this message incredibly profound. And that theme is only strengthened when you can draw the very real parallels of One Piece and our history, because our history is one of struggle and oppression, striving for freedom and meaning in our lives.